of humanize again the discourse around leadership.
The idea of this podcast is really to interview change makers.
They actually have this ability to still remain open.
The lab is a space where we can have innovative dialogue. We have interviewed young people. We've interviewed people from academia, civil society, public, private sector.
Have to do with different voices is how can we get them into a position where they're influencing, they're not just having access to certain spaces.
Change makers, they can be can be you within your own sphere of influence.
So, who are you?
So, I am Davide, and I'm from Italy, and I work with the Beyond Lab at UN Geneva, where I'm focusing on the work that we do on intergenerational impact.
Okay.
What about you?
I'm Amani Bathily, and I'm also with the lab. I've been there for 2 years. I'm the advocacy and project strategist.
Cool. So what does the Beyond Lab do?
What does the Beyond Lab do? So it works on long-term sustainability, which in a way is just a way of saying how can we build, a world where people and nature can thrive to their best. And it does so working on what we call systems change. And systems change is really a bit about how do you look at systems to either foster a kind of positive environment or the opposite. So typically we've looked at the economic system of, how can we go beyond growth at all costs, even if that costs us, natural resources or even in many cases human lives through inequality, etc. So the idea is really how can we rethink systems to build them around common values, for the benefit of people and planet. But we have different ways we look at that systems work. Maybe you can actually say a little bit more on that.
Yeah, definitely. So if we have a bit of a metaphor, it's like our systems have some wounds that we recognize, then we sort of need to find the recipe to cure them. And we think what are the different elements that are needed for this system to sort of recover. And with talking with different members of society, from governments to young people to activists to private sector, we really found out 4 key elements that all the conversations had in common as elements that are needed to recover. The first one is equity from an intergenerational point of view, so ensuring that current, past and future generations share the same amount of resources and opportunities. The second one is around hope. We live in very complicated times, and we really need hope to give energy and agency to people to actually make that change that they want to see in this world. The third part is around regeneration. So how do we know that resources are scarce? How can we work together and collectively to ensure that they will last and they will regenerate? And the fourth part is around the great unknowns. So we had examples like COVID or others that really shocked the systems, and we didn't know how to sort of embrace these sudden uncertainties that we were hit by. So how do we embrace uncertainty? How do we deal with the unknowns? And this is kind of like the fourth element. So working on these 4 elements as a way to recover the ones in our systems, I think that's kind of like where we're going to, and we're discussing about that, we're acting on that, and we're really trying to promote solutions and dialogues around them.
Mm-hmm. That's a good summary.
Yeah.
Okay. So why did you join the lab or work for the lab?
So I think among the different reasons, the one that really speaks most to me is that the lab is a place where, despite being in the UN, which seems, of course, like it's a big institution, traditional institutions, the lab is a space where we can have innovative dialogues. It's a safe space for that. and especially a space where you can ask big questions, both to yourself but also to people around you. So I love asking big questions, and that's why I'm asking you: is there a big question that you're currently asking yourself, that you have in mind?
So a big question I would have now, I would say honestly, well, I think over the like past maybe year or two, it's been quite a sad or even like anxious time, right? Looking a bit of at the world and the globe, and I think that like, I mean, many people are in this case, but you have social media and you have so much content coming through from honestly like really violent content up to the point of like, you know, children being killed, to really like disastrous information on the environment, etc. And I think that the huge question that then came to mind in a world that was seemed very divided, or I mean through technology, right, in a sense, was, well, how can we start like uniting again for a kind of common good? Because I really think that if we don't find ways to be able to build bridges, to be able to communicate, to be able to exchange with people who think differently or who speak differently, about different topics and global issues, we're actually never going to overcome the problems that we're seeing, and especially we're going to reproduce them. And so I think one of the big questions that I had was, well, how do you get people actually to unite in an empathetic way? And what's interesting is that I think I got to explore that actually through my work at the lab, and especially I think on hope. Yeah,
It's fantastic, and I'm sure we can speak more about that later on. But maybe a question now: what is this podcast actually about?
so interestingly, on the topic of uniting, I think that it's a lot about that. One of the things that was coming through is that maybe one of the reasons why people are struggling right now under such a polarization is that maybe, you know, things have rapidly changed and there's actually a lack of trust, I think, in like leadership or what we consider people representing global authority. And I think that that actually does, I mean, honestly extend also to the United Nations. There's a lot of questioning, you know, of what does it do, etc. But I really believe still in the values that it promotes, in the idea of multilateralism and globally exchanging and finding common solutions. So in a way, the podcast was about, well, how can we rehumanize that? Because there are many leaders, there are many people that are actually doing common good, and maybe not in the form that people sometimes imagine, right? Like kind of global authority or common good. But also, I think that what's really interesting is that these people are really human. So actually, they have vulnerabilities, they question themselves, they really have, I think, times where maybe they think, okay, maybe I was wrong on this, but actually that helped me grow and evolve. And I actually think that we can, I mean, anyone can really understand the fact that like not one individual is perfect. And I think we need to kind of humanize again the discourse around leadership. And honestly, I think the podcast is also a little bit about maybe going against a little bit of a trend, right? I listen to a lot of podcasts also in preparation to this. And there are so many podcasts that are, you know, like super business oriented. And you have, you know, this guy or woman who comes in and they're like, you know, if you do A, you'll get, you know, Z and you'll make 100K and just, you know, you have to just discipline yourself, etc. And that's true leadership, etc. And I find it really interesting because actually it's not. When you start realizing, like talking with people, you realize that actually leadership is complex, that there's no one answer. And thank God there's not one answer. There's like billions of us on Earth. So it was also about that. It's also about, again, like humanizing solutions and saying, okay, it's a bit complex, but maybe we can have these conversations. We can be more vulnerable around this and we can be, yeah, find more human solutions also for us.
What are the sort of key elements for these humanizations, or going back to humanity 101?
I think, I mean, one of the huge things, I think, is empathy. And honestly, even if many of us, I think, are empathetic, I think we all struggle to empathize with those whom we disagree with. And I found it really interesting interviewing different change makers or looking at their lives, because they actually have this ability to still remain open and listen and take in, different critiques and different priorities and build around that. I think that that's like a core thing. And yeah.
Like a genuine understanding of others and
a
different
genuine
point of
care,
views.
actually.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. Thank you.
So who are we interviewing on the podcast?
Yeah, I think, quoting you, human leaders, I would say. We think that leaders are always sort of maybe big political figures and that, but this is not really who we want to target, and the way that we see also leadership within this podcast. I think the idea of this podcast is really to interview change makers, inspiring people, change makers that can be can be you within your own sphere of influence. It can be big activists. It can be president. It can be sort of anyone. I think the idea is really to bring people that have inspiring stories and stories that can bring about hope for a better future. And yeah, we have interviewed young people. We've interviewed people from academia, civil society, public, private sector. That's really inspired this hope for change, I'd say. I guess you partially answered to that, but interacting with change makers, is there anything you see that they have in common?
Yeah, it goes back, it's true to the question of empathy, that they seem to have like a high level of empathy. But what's interesting is, yes, they tend to be kind of open to different priorities or different criticism, but they never seem to lose focus of a common goal. I find that quite interesting. So they're open, but they don't go in every single direction either. They're quite clear in their minds. And yeah. Do you think people are fundamentally good? Isn't that just idealistic?
That's a tough question. I don't think that people are either intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. I think we both coexist in between. Of course, we have very good sides, but we also have bad sides that I think there's a tendency to not want to talk about, not want to embrace, and not wanting to acknowledge. But I believe that this is not a constructive ways to sort of deal with ourselves and deal with the others. I think embracing and being aware of our sort of bad sides can allow us to, first of all, work on them, so self-work, but eventually can allow us to have more empathy, like what you were saying, towards the others, knowing that when we're faced with a interaction from another person that we think it's bad, we have to remind ourselves that this sides exist in ourselves as well, so within ourselves as well. So let's try to be a bit more empathetic, maybe more understanding, and thinking that we share also this sort of double nature too. So I believe that also being aware of the fact that we're not always super good or super bad can help us be more sort of patient and understanding towards the bad sides that we might see in other people. So yeah, this is kind of like what I believe so, and I think that this duality is something that we tend to forget, but it's something that we also want to push for a bit more awareness. You know, you spoke about humanizing and being a human. What does it really mean? It's not always rainbows and flowers, right? So we really have to sort of acknowledge the two, I would say.
No, and I think actually, like, jumping on that, I think it's quite interesting how we expect from kind of authority or leadership to have everything straight and they're never allowed to go wrong. And I wonder, honestly, if that's caused maybe some of the leadership that we see today, because it's almost you can never admit fault. And so you just have to run with whatever you've decided. And I think that, yeah, as you said, if we actually acknowledge more of a duality, maybe it could also even lead to more like collective leadership, because I think that more people
Totally.
could see themselves as, you know, leaders of change, because they would realize, okay, I don't have to be perfect or have all the answers, but I can just start, you know, acting on change now. In your work at the United Nations, you speak a lot about time. For example, you have a pact for the future, you had a summit of the future. Why is that?
Yeah, so we just spoke about duality, right? Duality within sort of human nature, if we want. But this, we work on different levels of duality, and one of the dualities that we work on is the duality around time, and which is sort of the short term versus the long term. We know that we are living in systems that are often extractive. We know that we're not doing so well in terms of resources, both environmentally, socially, economically speaking. So there was this common understanding in 2024 with the Summit of the Future that we really need to boost our actions to safeguard our planet and our people for future generations and of course generations to come. I think there was the awareness that we really need to establish a bit of a balance between what we're doing today and what is needed to have a good and safe tomorrow. It's like a buffet. We're eating nowadays at this buffet, and we're just so greedy that we're not really leaving any food for those to come after us. So how can we make sure that there is enough for those that are coming after us? How can we make sure that the resources, that even the one that we consume, can be regenerated in a circular way? And how can we sort of, by doing so, how can we foster a bit of collective care, right? You really spoke about care, and it's something that really, I think, drives both the work of the lab, but in general, what we do is really, how can we ignite again collective care? We're living in a world where we're so focused on our own identity, our own benefits, and there seems to be no space for care. How can we foster action and dialogues to instill that back into the system? So this is kind of like the idea of a balance between what is needed now, what is needed for tomorrow, and what is needed for our own well-being and for sort of a collective one. So this is kind of like the reasons why we really focus so much on time. And some may say that we don't have it anymore. There's this sense of urgency that we don't have time and we need to act now. Fair, but we need to act now for what? So let's consider also sort of the long-term implications of our actions compared to the needs that a lot of people have today. Because sometimes thinking long-term can also be seen as a privilege for those that are actually can allow themselves to think in a long term. There are some others that cannot, right? Because they have immediate pressing urgencies and needs to deal with. So how to establish this balance?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the point on some people who have pressing needs or might have a like different relationship to time, like being both kind of from the West and also from the global South, but being from West Africa. I find it interesting because, right, in terms of like, for example, climate change, or in terms of sometimes just immediate needs that you would have on a regular basis. I know that, like, obviously my family in West Africa, things need to change more quickly, right? But what's interesting is we're a lot more stressed within, I would say, the Western Hemisphere, and a lot more running after time. I mean, this morning, even is a good example, right? Like we're like late. It's like panic, etc. of half an hour.
For 3
Where I come
minutes.
from in West Africa, like half an hour is I don't even know if it's a concept, in that
Counted. Okay.
sense. So I just find that interesting how actually we act in a way as if things are so urgent, yet actually we would have the privilege to think long term. But those who, in a sense, are sometimes actually a lot more calmer, have less of that privilege. And maybe it says something about how we should navigate change. Maybe we should actually just be a bit more chill in change. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe something that I can also sort of relate to is that I'm 28 and we're sort of like, there's a lot of instances where we are asked to think long term and plan big time ahead when if you think about it, all around us, everything is designed not to last anymore.
Yeah.
We have snack content on social media that don't last for more than 20 seconds. We have short contracts at work. We have commitment issues in relationships that there's not lasting anymore. We have everything around us, from personal to professional to entertainment sphere. It's not really designed to inspire us to act in the long run. And we have to be, I guess, honest also when speaking with different constituencies or different people, such as also young people like us, I guess. What are we asking them? What are they familiar with? What are we familiar with? So how do we sort of also strike a balance between sort of this vision, but also the reality of facts? And how can we be a bit more patient and understanding in our process? That's cool. Yeah, so in your work, you talk about marginalized voices. And I'd like to know, what are these voices and why is that?
So, marginalized voices, how would I define that? I think it's basically anyone who hasn't been, in the mainstream discourse, culturally, intellectually, etc. So often people talk, for example, like indigenous people, but also it's people who have economically often been quite underprivileged. It's often people who come from sometimes ex-colonies, etc. So actually, what's really interesting is probably it's most of the world.
Okay.
So it's interesting when we say marginalized, because it's probably, majority of the world, because the majority of the world actually lives in certain economic conditions and social conditions. But I would say, why do we want to privilege their voices? Well, one, because it is actually about privileging also the majority. But secondly, because I think that often people think of like inclusion and diversity as some sort of like a nice to have, and we're being very nice, to those very diverse groups, because we're finally, we're including them in, and actually we forget what they bring. And the reality is that if you have had to build yourself or develop yourself as a people, as a culture, or as an individual in a system that wasn't designed for you, you probably actually have a much better, knowledge of how do you navigate uncertainty. And actually that's the point where we're at, right? Like, whether we want it or not, things are rapidly changing. And we need to think, okay, how are we going to navigate this new world, this change? A lot of, our kind of social codes, everything that we built, our knowledge and our kind of standards on is shifting. So how are we going to navigate that as a group? And actually, I think that those who have experienced being put aside, experienced colonization, experienced different form of oppression, know best how to do that. And so I think it's really important that we start listening now, because they really hold many of the answers.
And how do you think we can sort of ensure that these voices are given the right sort of justice within these spaces? Is there like ways that we can ensure that okay, it's happening in the right way, and not like you were saying, just as a nice to have.
Yeah.
Or
I think that's like the biggest key. I've worked a lot on systemic change for that reason, because I think that things have to be integrated within a system. I think it's not enough to just, invite them at an event or put them, at a certain table. Actually, one of the change makers we interviewed, Kumi, says that there's a big difference between access and influence. So he says, like he realized for a long time, you can have access to certain people. That doesn't mean you're influencing them. And I think that that's what we have to do with different voices, is how can we get them into a position where they're influencing, they're not just having access to certain spaces. And I think that that happens through institutionalizing their knowledge, their culture, a different way of doing, which is also, I guess, some of the work that we're doing, right? Like when we say, oh, we want to think long term, that's not something that we've invented.
Yeah.
That's something that's existed in many cultures, in indigenous cultures. There's the 7-generation principle that comes from North America, etc. So there's actually, that already exists among many cultures. But the question is, how do we translate that within our current system, so it becomes also like a factual reality?
So like from sort of to the center of the narratives that are around development and sort of progress and sort of resilience in a way. So no, it's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
So you say sustainability is about building a thriving world for people and planet. But concretely, what does that mean? What does this common vision look like?
What does that mean? I wish I had the right answer. I unfortunately I don't have it. But from sort of the work that we've been doing and from what I've witnessed, I think that building a common vision around agency for a better world, in a sense, lies on allowing people to building structures for people to find their own sort of purpose in a way. So making sort of fostering the sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves, and sort of allowing them to have their own individuality preserved even within the collective one. So the collective identity of their own groups. So I think really fostering a bit of agency and hope around purpose, so around the possibility of fully developing their own potential, but allowing their potential to unfold within a collective setup. I think that a lot of times nowadays we sort of like, it's like we grieve our own identity and the loss of our own identity versus the one of the collective. Whereas we need to flip a bit the narrative and saying how our own identity can be enriched instead by the one of the collective. So, and through this enrichment, then we would find, I guess, the ultimate purpose of these common visions that we all have. So I think that's a bit what I'm understanding, and I think that's what we're really trying to push also in our work. But